Hi, today I'm going to show you how to fast charge lithium-ion 18650 batteries by using TP4056 modules. In this project I connected two TP4056s in parallel, as you can see. There are two of them. There is a 18650 battery holder that is PCB type, so I just mounted this PCB type battery holder to the perf board and the TP4056 modules to the perf board. They're glued, but I also added a bunch of solder on the back of them and added heat sinks on the top of them so the chips would not overheat and throttle. If the TP4056 starts throttling, it would output less current than it possibly could do. One chip can output 1 amp, and with two chips we can charge batteries up to 2 amps with these chips. I saw some videos online that they would attach heat sinks with fans to the TP4056 and change the programmable resistor on them to make them output more than 2 amps, which is not practical. Adding a heat sink with a fan to a tiny little chip so that it can go higher current than it's specified is not a good idea, and the chip may get damaged. They say they don't get damaged or overheated, and they can just supply the current without any issue, but I don't trust that, to be honest. Stressing the chip beyond what it's designed to output is not a good idea in my opinion. So I just used two modules wired up in parallel. So I only made this micro USB port usable, and I kind of covered this up with some hot glue. The inputs are completely paralleled, and the outputs are also completely paralleled, and the outputs go into the battery holder, 18650 battery holder. So I added some solder on the bottom to give extra cooling. Otherwise, even if I attach these small coolers with thermal paste, they still throttle a bit. So the best thing I could do to stop them throttling is to add more thermal mass, and I had some crappy solder in hand, and I just put a bunch of solder in here on the bottom of the chips, and the flux from the solder kind of conducts the heat and lets the heat transfer. Since this is a perf board with holes, throw hole components you can just put through. If you used thermal paste, it would just get everywhere and it wouldn't be ideal, and I didn't want to use thermal paste, so I just put the chips on here when the solder is frozen but the flux is still hot and sort of liquid. I just pushed the modules on there like so with gloves so that I wouldn't burn my fingers. When the solder is still hot but it is solidified, not the flux is solidified but solder itself, the flux is still sort of liquid, and you can still attach the module with flux on here, which kind of helps with the heat transfer because flux kind of conducts heat. I'm talking about the solders in core flux, by the way, not those paste type of fluxes. They could cause some damage to the PCB if you use that type of flux and solder that contains that type of flux. You need to use solder that contains rosin flux if you're going to do something like this. And if you don't want to do this, or you don't have crappy solder on hand and you don't want to waste high quality solder, you can just attach a little bit bigger heat sinks on the chips, and that would probably solve the throttling issue, because these chips, not even when they're connected in parallel, usually drop down to 750 milliamps when charging. Like, they throttle quite a bit when they overheat, and it happens a lot. They heat up a lot and it's a problem. So we just solved it with these heat sinks and the solder points to add more thermal mass on the back. and I attached these heat sinks with some thermal compound. I just pushed the heat sinks on with thermal compound, and the heatsink surface is kind of flat and the chip is also kind of flat, so it just sucks the chip to the heatsink, like suctions it, and it just makes it like stay there. And when it's suctioned to the chip with thermal paste, basically stuck on there with thermal paste, I just added some amount of hot glue on the sides that would make it permanent, like so. So if you just bump it, it's not gonna come off. You can also use screws to attach this, but you would need a longer heatsink than this. These are small little transistor heatsinks, and I just used it to mount it on these SMD components right here, and that's basically it, because these modules get very hot and we need to use thermal compound or thermal pads to efficiently transfer the heat from the chips themselves and to the aluminum heat sinks right here with the fins. I also need to make some warnings here. If you have a very low capacity 18650 battery, or a damaged 18650 battery, or heavily worn out 18650 battery, do not fast charge it. It can cause it to catch fire, explode, or damage it further. I do not recommend fast charging like a 500 milliamp hour battery or a heavily worn down battery that maybe came out of a notebook battery pack, and I do not recommend fast charging old batteries. You can fast charge new fresh batteries and you wouldn't have any problems, and I also recommend you to monitor the battery's temperature all the time while you're fast charging them, and you should immediately stop fast charging the batteries if they get too hot, because fast charging batteries, when the batteries are above 38 degrees Celsius, can lead to some capacity losses, and above 50 degrees Celsius it can cause serious damage to the battery and may cause it to explode even. And working with lithium ion and 18650 batteries with battery chargers, like working with these, are pretty dangerous. So if you don't know what you're doing, I do not recommend you to make this circuit. Some people say that you cannot parallel to TP4056 modules and like connect them in parallel. You can't do that, they say, but I didn't have any issues, and they charged this power extra cell from 0 to 100 in like an hour, one and a half hours, when normally it's charged with a single TP4056 it takes around 2.5 hours to 3 hours. And I had no issues with using them in parallel, like no overheating issues, even though I attached some heat sinks. That wouldn't be a problem anyway, but they heat up even when they're like loaded at 1 amp and not being wired up in parallel. I also tried to make the connections as short as possible, these wires, because I didn't have thick wires in hand, and just added a bunch of solder to these joints so that they wouldn't get like heated up because of the high currents. Because I didn't have very thick wires, so I just made the connections very short, as short as possible, and that's basically how I made this. So we have two batteries, as you can see here. This Profuse, which actually isn't a very good brand of battery. I just bought this because it was cheap and I needed to use it in a project that doesn't require a lot of power draw, and because of that it can just run for a long time, because as I said, it doesn't need a lot of power draw. So this is a Profuse 18650 1200 milliamp hour battery. I bought it for very cheap, and the actual capacity is just 800 milliamps, so not very good, but I fast charged this, which is like above 2C of the battery's rating, like a little bit over 2C, and I found like no data sheets for this battery. I can't find any data sheets for Profuse, so I don't know the max charging current C, in C. What I mean by C is just if you charge this 1200 milliamp hour battery in 1200 milliamps or 1.2 amps, you're charging the battery in 1C. And if you charge it in 2.4 amps, if assuming the battery is actually 1200 milliamp hours, it is charged at 2C. Since the original capacity, like the actual capacity of the battery, is only 800 milliamp hours, the 2C charging current would be 1.6 amps, but I was able to charge it at 2 amps, but it would drop down to around 1.5 amps because the battery is being charged very quick. And I was able to charge this battery in like 30 to 45 minutes, and I didn't have any overheating issues, so I just charged it up like that. And also did a capacity test. It was fine, 800 milliamps still, from like 4.2 volts to down to 3 volt discharge I'm talking about. And I don't recommend you to discharge 18650s below 3 volts. You can go 2.8 volts or 2.5 volts if your battery is very high quality, but I don't even recommend that to like prolong battery life. And if you go below like 2.5, it's just gonna cause damage to the battery. So this battery is filled right now. Let me just show it to you at my multimeter. I'm not gonna charge this battery in the video. I'm gonna charge this power extra. So if we check the voltage on this battery, I'm just gonna show it to you on my multimeter, like so. Make sure the probes are in the right place, and it's at 4.11, which is almost full. It's like 90% full. And I also fast charged this battery before the video, and I had no issues. Also did another fast charge and capacity test, and it was no issues, no overheating. Just the battery just gets a little bit warm, while the charging modules get quite hot, even though they're cooled off. But they don't throttle, so that's a good thing. And yeah, I had no issues by charging this 18650 in 2C, even though I can't find any data sheets to it, and I can't find any charging currents. Usually if a battery is like high quality, made by a good brand, it's at least 3C max charging current in C's, in C rate, and this power extra can actually handle 3C charging and discharging at the same time. So it's 2500 milliamp hour, and I actually was able to find a data sheet for this battery, and on the data sheet it says 3C charging and discharging. So this 3C rate on this battery, which is 2500 milliamp hours, means that you can charge it and discharge it at 7.5 amps, which is quite a big current. And even though it says you can, if the battery gets too hot, I don't recommend you to discharge it or charge it at that rate. Maybe like 6 amps, 5 amps is a little bit more suitable to like prolong the battery's life. And if I measure this battery right now on my multimeter, it's flat, 3.03. So I usually discharge my lithium-ion batteries in like down to 3 volts at max. I mean at minimum, not max, because I want to prolong the battery life. So let's put this battery, discharge battery, into the battery holder. And TP4056 modules don't have reverse polarity protection, so you should be really careful about which in which polarity you're putting the battery in. So this is plus and this is minus, and minus goes to minus and plus goes to plus. Don't mix this up or you will get fireworks. So we just click the battery in place like this, and I recommend you to use a high quality charger, like from a good brand, a good and known brand, not some crappy Chinese chargers, because if they fail while they're outputting power, they could damage the TP4056 chips and may even short out your battery. So I'm going to use a Samsung 10 watts, which is like 5 volts at 2 amps max, 10 watts phone phone charger like so, and I'm also going to use this USB measure meter like so to measure the current that goes into the battery. So we're gonna just plug this into the wall socket right here on this extension cable, and the voltage is 5.22 volts, which is good. Don't go away. And I will also be using a Samsung charging cable that isn't used too much, so the micro USB connector isn't worn down too much. That way it can deliver more amps, so that it could handle more like charging current. And this is an original charging cable from Samsung, so I'm just going to plug it into here like so. Flip this like this and plug it in, and let's see what's the charging current. Let's see. Yep, 2 amps as you can see, which is the max rate for both the... I'm gonna unplug it for now because I also want to make a time lapse showing that the battery is charging, and I also want to add the time lapse to the video so you can see fast forwarded battery charging at 2 amps with this fast charger that I made, and actually just see how fast the battery charges. So the module already got hot after like 5 seconds. They got pretty warm, and that's why I attached the heat sinks. So it's pretty important. So I'm just going to plug this battery in to this charger, and we're gonna see in time lapse how much it's gonna charge. And I'm also going to hook up my multimeter to see its state of charge right here. I'm going to hold the hold select button, which turns off auto power off mode on Unity multimeters, so that it wouldn't like power off after 10 minutes of not being used. So the voltage is at 3.11 volts already, and if I plug it back in, the voltage, as you can see, rises to 3.2. I'm not going to continue. I'm going to make the Turkish version of this video and then make the time-lapse and add the time-lapse footage to both videos. So see you on the next video, and here's the charging time-lapse of this battery charging at 2 amps with this fast charger.